Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us today. On behalf of the Online Events Committee and Young Scholars Committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. My name is Yazga Genç. I am an assistant professor at Ithaca College and a member of the IAFFE's Young Scholars and Online Events Committee. Today's event is a part of an ongoing IAFFE Academy series that provides professional development opportunities for those new to the feminist economics and also providing insights to help build their skills in the field. The previous events in this series are available on IAFFE's YouTube channel, and today's event will also be recorded on posted YouTube. We also have online events and numerous other event tracks, so please look out for more information regarding those and catch up on the past events you may have missed on IAFFE's YouTube channel. As this is a Zoom meeting and not a webinar, it's a friendly reminder to keep yourself muted, and there will be a Q&A session of this event in which we will invite you to use the raise hands function to ask questions. And you can also ask your questions through the chat and add your comments and share resources through the chat during the event.
Everything.
So this event will feature discussions with the editors of Feminist Economics. So it offers general tips for writing effective reviews, discuss the process of knowledge production, and explore the critical role of reviewing in this context. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for today's events. So we will have Wendy Sigle. She's based on London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK. She will share her insights on the reviewing process as an associate editor of Feminist Economics. And then we have Elissa Braunstein. She is based on Colorado State University in the States. She will be the discussants for Wendy's presentation as an editor of Feminist Economics Journal. Wendy and Elissa, welcome. Thank you for being here. It is a great pleasure to host you today and have the opportunity to listen your editorial work in the journal. And I would like to start with Wendy by asking her to share how knowledge is produced in Feminist Economics Journal and what is the role of reviewing in this process.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming along today. I'm really happy to have the chance to talk to you about how to review. I often tell my own students that nobody ever talked to me about how to review papers. And when I think back to the first paper that I ever reviewed, I still kind of turn crimson with embarrassment because I really didn't know what I was doing. And I just knocked my camera off. Hold on. There we go. Just knocked my camera off. Sorry. So I think it's really good to have explicit conversations about how to review and talk about best practice, and also really have an explicit conversation about why we do peer review, what peer review is for, which is important for actually understanding what a good peer review report looks like, how it's used. But it also, for early career scholars, I think helps you think a little bit about what research is and what your role as a researcher and a reviewer is. Because again, that's something else we don't tend to talk about very explicitly. We just expect people to maybe pick it up by osmosis. And if you're like me, that sometimes can take a little while and a lot of trial and error. And it saves a bit of pain if we just have a conversation to begin with. So I have some slides ready, which I will talk through in the next sort of 25-30 minutes. And then I'll turn to Elissa and we'll have a bit more of a conversation format and then open up to everyone for a Q&A. And I will try not to bang my desk and knock over my camera again. Fingers crossed. Get my slides up. Hopefully everyone can see that. So turning to the presentation, I wanted to acknowledge a colleague of mine, Rebecca Sear. I've done several presentations in a range of different formats, talking to early career scholars about how to peer review. And some of the slides I'm going to show you are taken from a presentation designed and delivered with Rebecca Sear. So I wanted to acknowledge her contribution and labor to some of what you're going to see. So I wanted to start.
Wendy, sorry to interrupt. We cannot see your slides if you shared already.
Oh, I thought I did share. So sorry.
Okay.
Can you all see that now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And that's much better because I can see you all too. Let's get this up. Okay. So I just acknowledged the contribution and labor of Rebecca Sear, and turning to the presentation itself, I wanted to start by asking you all to think a little bit about what a research article is. When we talk about what research articles are, we often talk about how they're structured. We talk about the components of them. They have an introduction, they have a literature review, and you could think about talking about a research article in terms of its constituent parts and how they're related to each other. But you can also sort of conceptualize things by talking about more broadly what they do and don't do and what we understand them to be. And I think an equally valid way of conceptualizing a research article is to draw on non-alcoholic options are available, but my cocktail party metaphor. And I think it's interesting or useful to think about research as an intervention or part of a conversation. And thinking about the cocktail party metaphor allows you to sort of think about the kinds of conversation that research represents. If, as a student or an early career researcher, you think about the academic field as a cocktail party that's underway and you show up, there's already a lot of people who are enjoying themselves and having conversations. And as a student, you might sort of walk around the edge of the room trying to figure out who is who and what people are talking about. And often as a student, you learn how to kind of hear what people are saying, understand what people are saying, represent the conversations that are going on. But as you become more of a researcher, you have to figure out what conversations you want to join. And if you become a really sort of social butterfly academically, you might see people having conversations at two different parts of the room and decide it would be really interesting to bring person A and person B together and put them in conversation and engage in a conversation with them together. But your research ends up being part of this kind of academic discussion that's going on. And it is contributing to, adding to, and taking those discussions forward. And that's often what people mean when they talk about research as being a contribution to knowledge. It's a contribution to ongoing disciplinary discussions and debates. And when we think about peer reviewing research, it's helpful to think about research as that kind of contribution. Who are the people that are having conversations out there that this research seems to be speaking to? Does this piece of research seem to be taking conversations forward in a new or different way? Are they helping resolve maybe some things that people disagree on or are unable to resolve amongst themselves? What is this research intervention doing when we think about the room full of people at the cocktail party or the sort of academic discipline? When we talk about the formal peer review process, it's helpful to look at a general overview. Every journal will do something different. Here I have provided the peer review process as Taylor and Francis, the journal, the publishing company that handles Feminist Economics. Their sort of general depiction of what the peer review process looks like. And it's slightly different for Feminist Economics. But the general peer review process is that a paper gets submitted and an editor, which would be in the case of Feminist Economics, Elissa, receives a paper. And the editor checks the paper's fit given the journal's aims and scope. And this relates a little bit to those kind of conversations I was just talking about with that cocktail party metaphor. In feminist economics, associate editors agree to take responsibility for papers once they've got through step 2. So the associate editor invites 2 to 3 reviewers, and they're sent the paper if they agree to provide. Pardon? They agree to provide their views, and the reviewers then submit their reviews in a written report. And these reports take a certain form, which we'll get into in subsequent slides. Based on the content of the reviews, in the case of feminist economics, the associate editor checks the reviews, makes a recommendation for a decision, and provides an overview assessment of the different views of the reviewers. And it goes to the managing editor, who communicates with the author the final decision, whether it is a reject, major or minor revisions. If it's not an outright reject, the author sometimes has the opportunity to make amendments to the paper and resubmit it. And if those amendments are satisfactory, having been sent out to the reviewers or having been reassessed by the associate editor, it is accepted and moves into publication. I provided a link along the side of this slide, which contains some specific information about training opportunities and sort of guidance on peer review that's provided by Taylor and Francis, the publisher of Feminist Economics. I personally find what is on that site pretty generic, and I think, especially given the aims and scope of feminist economics, it's useful to have this kind of more targeted discussion. And I'll also point out where maybe my advice deviates a little bit from what you would see on the Taylor and Francis guidance. But it's always good to review this kind of information from publishers as well, if you're new to the review process. Part of the peer review process that I think it's important to underscore, and I think it's important to underscore one aspect of it for early career researchers in particular, and that is that peer review is about getting a balance. We've talked about the conversations happening and how research might make an intervention into different conversations. If I ask early career people often what peer review is functioning, what the function of peer review is, people will often tell me that they see it as making sure that you don't let bad research through, that you provide a critical assessment of research and you decide whether it's good enough, and if it's not good enough, it doesn't get published. But you also need to think about the consequences of keeping good research out. And you don't want to be so critical of research that you actually stop conversations from happening because you have such high standards about what research has to do in order to be published that new ideas can't be mooted. Sometimes interesting ideas are still a little bit flawed or underdeveloped, but they might be such interesting ideas or have such potential that it's worth considering whether actually airing them as part of the academic discussions and exchange is going to be good for the discipline, good for the journal, good for readers of the journal. So when you're thinking about doing peer review, you want to think both about, is the research good enough, but also what if people don't get exposed to the ideas that this researcher is presenting? What are the costs of that? And also, what are the costs if we keep that research out now, but it still gets submitted to other journals? So the benefits of getting that balance right means that we ensure that good quality research gets read and put to use, that conversations remain interesting and exciting within the discipline. If we get it wrong, we might keep new and potentially useful ideas and evidence out of the discussion. In the biomedical context, only about half of biomedical research is published. And that means especially because of incentives to publish only positive results, a lot of research doesn't actually get aired and read and contribute to thinking. The cost of getting it wrong can also be inefficient, because if people submit the same article or really minorly changed articles to multiple journals before they get published, this means that the burden on editors and reviewers goes up, because the same paper ends up being read and reviewed and processed multiple times, and that takes a lot of labor. And academics are time constrained and busy, and from just a feminist ethics of care, we want to think about making sure that the amount of labor that we ask of colleagues, particularly taking into account that this kind of journal-related labor is provided without much compensation, that we think about the issue of efficiency as well. But to get the balance right, we need to think about what good research is. How do we make sure that we strike that balance and that we let good research in? So a good research article is one, I think, that actually does contribute new and interesting ideas that helps take discussions forward. I'm also an editor of a journal called Population Studies, and I remember talking to another editor on that journal probably about 15 years ago now. And one of the things he said about population studies, which he was proud of as a journal, was that it didn't prioritize high-tech quantitative methods over substance. And he said, as a consequence, we sometimes published really, really interesting ideas that other people perfected, honed, and took forward, even if they were at a preliminary stage. And I think those articles did more to contribute to the discipline than incremental and technically really competent articles. And that's something that's always stuck out in my mind. And he was sort of comparing that to other articles in other journals that he thought tended to prioritize more like this sort of technical tick box exercise. And in the case of economics, you know, is it getting at causal inference better? Is it dealing, you know, with unobserved heterogeneity and selection bias? All of that might be technically great, but if the question itself isn't terribly interesting and it's not really contributing new knowledge, how much of a contribution is that compared to maybe something that really reorients thinking in the field, but might not necessarily be 100% worked out? So a good research article is not necessarily just about doing things perfectly rigorously and prescriptively as we've been taught to do it, but it's also a research article which engages in new and interesting ways. So it would be really helpful if people could mute themselves, please, because we can hear background noise, and I keep thinking people are asking me questions. When you write a peer review, it's important to keep in mind that your peer review has two audiences. When I talked about the cocktail party, you want to think about writing an article for an intended audience, and those are the people who are having the conversation that you want to join. When you write your peer review report, your intended audience is twofold. You are writing to the editor who's asked you to do the peer review to share your thoughts on the article, but you're writing a report that you also know will be passed on to the author. So you have to produce a report that meets the needs of both those intended audiences. Usually, in my experience, peer review reports are written in a way that describes the paper almost in third person, like you're talking directly to the editor. But I have seen people who prefer to actually write reports where they engage with the author directly. But in both cases, you need to look at the review and think about whether you're giving the editor sufficient information to see what this paper is doing, what its potential is, and how well it's meeting its potential. When you agree to produce a peer review for Feminist Economics, associate editors score each report's timeliness, quality and completeness of the assessment. And one of the things I love about Feminist Economics is that editors assess the tone of the review. Timeliness basically means you deliver the report when you say you're going to deliver it. And that's really important because when people submit papers, they're waiting to get the reviews back. And if you agree to review something and then there's a delay getting your report, or even worse, if you are then subsequently unable to deliver it and we have to get a new reviewer, we end up making the authors wait, which is particularly distressing, I think, for early career people who need to get publications out for things like promotion and for the job market. So timeliness is important just to show that you're a peer reviewer who delivers when you say you're going to deliver. And it's okay if you're asked to peer review and you don't think that you can deliver in the time allotted to ask for a more reasonable amount of time. That is much better than to try and do it and miss the deadline and have the editor wondering when that report's going to come. So never be shy about kind of having that discussion. And I think associate editors or editors will tell you if the amount of time that you need isn't going to work given the time frame that they're working with and the other reviews they have coming in. So timeliness is relatively straightforward to describe. The other two dimensions, I think it's worth thinking about and going over in a bit more detail. What does it mean to produce a complete and high quality assessment? I should also say when associate editors score the report, it's combined into a total score. And Elissa can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the second dimension, quality and completeness of the assessment, is given double weight. And so it's 50, 25, 25. And your review is given a score, thanks. And that is saved in the system so that when somebody is thinking of asking somebody to review in the future, they can actually see what scores people got in the past. So if you think about these dimensions, the first thing I would say is, well, what does it mean to have a complete and high quality assessment? What should you base your review on? When I'm talking to people about what kind of reviews I find useful, both as an editor and as an author, I think the most important thing that I like to underscore is that the report needs to first think about the author's intended contribution as you understand it, and then the quality of the work carried out to meet the author's aims and objectives. It's really easy to see a paper on a topic, and it's a paper on a topic that you like to write about, and start assessing the paper as the paper that you would write. And to write a review that is all about asking the author to produce the paper you would write. And it's really helpful to make yourself start with a statement. As I understand it, this paper aims to do A, B, and C. And use that as a point of focus for the rest of your comments to avoid going off into asking the author to write your paper rather than their paper. So you want to look at the motivation that the author provides, why the author thinks the topic is important or interesting to the intended audience, which would be readers of the journal. What does the author want the intended audience to understand or do after reading this paper? Does the author present an analysis that allows them to meet their aims and objectives as you understand them? And does the author make evaluations of the evidence which relate to the intended contribution and follow directly from the analysis that was carried out? I think this is useful both because what I already said, you're working with what the author was trying to do, but it can also be really useful for the author to see what you understood the intended contribution to be, because it might not be what they think the intended contribution is. I say this as an author. Sometimes you've written a paper and you don't realize that people aren't seeing the intended contribution you're trying to make coming through. So as a reviewer, if you start off by engaging with the author saying, I think you're trying to do this based on my reading of the paper, it can be really helpful for the author that says, well, actually, I wasn't trying to do that. How did the reviewer get that idea? And then it also situates the comments and suggestions that you make because they all relate to your understanding of what you thought the author was trying to do. A high quality assessment also would talk about the clarity of the presentation, how clear the arguments are, how easy it is to follow the logic, whether there seems to be logical leaps. And a complete assessment would also consider journal-specific criteria. Feminist Economics has very detailed information, which I think are fabulous for authors, both in terms of style, but also in terms of its editorial policies. And the editorial policies are very specific about how statistical evidence should be reported and dealt with. And it's really useful as a reviewer to be familiar with that and keep that in mind as you're evaluating the paper, the author's aims and objectives, and how they go about meeting them. I always tell people that I don't think your job is to proofread a paper as a peer reviewer. It's useful to mention if the paper needs extensive proofreading or editing for language, but your job isn't a copy editor or a proofreader. So I wouldn't feel that not proofreading the paper would mean that I thought the review was incomplete or not complete enough. A helpful and complete and high quality assessment is about what you cover, but it's also about how you deliver that information in a way that is accessible both to the editor and the author. When I'm writing a report or when I'm asking other people, I have my students actually peer review one another's projects in some of the courses that I teach. I advise students to structure their peer reviews by beginning with a brief summary of the work, which sets out your understanding of the author's aims and objectives and their intended contribution. And a statement of whether the author meets her or his aims as you understand them. In terms of suggestions for improvement, I suggest framing all of those suggestions about whether the author is making the intended contribution as you understand it. And then use that as a point of reference to almost justify and explain why the suggestions that you're making need to be made. And you can consider structuring the review so that you prioritize the things that are really important, essential recommendations, and then minor or non-essential recommendations, or sometimes ordering points in order of importance as you understand them, as well as structuring the report so that you have this point of focus, which is what the author is trying to do. It's also important to think about the tone. It's useful to be constructive. Remember, you're talking with a colleague. And it's useful to be clear. And this is where I deviate a little bit from the Taylor and Francis guidance on their website. They have some examples of positive assessments of papers, but they present sentences which have positive assessments but don't explain why that positive assessment was made. I think whatever assessment you make, it's always useful to follow it with a because, so that the editor and the author sees why you made the assessment that you did. In my entire career, I can't think of many papers that I've submitted to journals where I haven't had one reviewer tell me that the paper is beautifully written and structured, and another one say that it is appallingly written. That's subjective. And if somebody thinks it's appallingly written, it's useful for me to know that they think my sentences are too long. Or they have an idea of what goes in the introduction and they think I've been a little bit too detailed in the introduction. But to use a word like appalling doesn't really tell me what I need to do to make the paper better in the eyes of that reviewer. So the because is really helpful. It points to what needs to be done. It makes the case for what needs to be done. And it also helps the editor or associate editor decide whether to really emphasize that as something that the author needs to address if they're going to revise and resubmit the paper. And in terms of tone, I think, for feminist economics, but I would say this everywhere, it's really just a matter of being feminist. To be a feminist means that we're concerned about issues of power and control in research. We don't have to behave in a nasty way just because lots of other people who peer review write harsh reviews and comments. We know that people who do critical work or do interdisciplinary work, which is often really hard to communicate, sometimes struggle to get their message across, trying to create spaces of empathy and support. And this doesn't mean that you don't be critical, but that you be supportive and engaging and mentoring, and that you show that you are trying to help your feminist colleague meet their aims, can result in a peer review that has a much better constructive tone and which the author is going to understand and engage with more positively. Sometimes there is a comments to the editor box where you can express stronger, although I would still emphasize polite views on the paper. But I think it's important to keep in mind, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, nobody told me how to peer review, and I had to learn by looking at examples from papers I submitted and papers that I saw. And if all I ever did was unreflectively mimic what I saw in the review process, particularly from some mainstream economics journals, I would be a really nasty reviewer. And just because some people are nasty reviewers doesn't mean we all need to be. And it's important from a feminist perspective to be reflective about research practice as it relates to how you conduct research, how you cite. You definitely want to cite other feminists, and how you engage with other feminist scholars and try and be the change you'd like to see in the world. A less helpful review, both for authors and for editors, is one that is more of an unstructured stream of consciousness, where it's difficult to actually understand what you really think needs to be done for the author to meet their aims and objectives. Comments that are narrow in focus, the only qualifier I would give you here, sometimes you might be asked to provide a peer review because you have a narrow set of expertise that an editor really wants comments on. And in that case, narrowly focused comments are okay because you've kind of agreed that with the editor to begin with. But focusing on one narrow aspect of the paper when you've agreed to provide an overall assessment of the paper is less helpful. Assessments which criticize or applaud without explanation. I've already sort of touched on that when I was saying about the positive assessment examples that Taylor and Francis gives. To say this paper does not make a strong enough contribution to merit publication in a top journal like Feminist Economics without any explanation doesn't help me really understand what the limitations of the paper are, whether they could be addressed, why they might not likely be addressed. So that kind of assessment needs to be followed with some explanation. And on the flip side, this is a strong paper whose publication I enthusiastically support. Why do you support it? What do you think the paper is doing? What do you think the contribution is? A less helpful review, this is summarizing something else I said before, demands to see the paper that the reviewer would have written. And a less helpful review is abusive or sarcastic in tone. You want the reviewer to be somebody who is helping the author achieve their aims and objectives better. And an abusive or sarcastic tone in a peer review report can alienate the author and mean that they don't engage with the comments or might not even understand them because they're so taken aback by what feels like an attack. It's often helpful to kind of read your peer review report out loud and see how that sounds as you hear it, and think how you would feel if you were getting comments like that. So those are my tips. Many of them general, but some of them very specific to feminist economics. If you are asked to peer review, I think it's super important that you read the style guidelines and the editorial guidelines and reporting statistics, and make sure that you think about that as you're assessing papers, particularly quantitative ones. And also keep in mind that one of the things that we're really interested in is that reviewers do engage with a constructive and mentoring tone. So thank you. I will stop sharing and try not to knock my camera over again.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, that was really detailed presentation. Thank you so much. Elissa, would you like to step in as a discussant?
Sure. I have a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's really nice to see you. I'm a little under the weather, so my voice sounds a little nasally. But Wendy, thank you for that overview. I had imagined that this next part would be more of a conversation where I would ask Wendy a few things about how she approaches particular dilemmas with reviewing. And so one of them is, how do you approach reviewing a paper that with feminist economic frameworks, that engages with feminist economic frameworks, but maybe doesn't meet the journal's standards for a contribution? You talked about incremental technical exercises earlier versus contributing new knowledge to the field. So how do you approach a review like that?
I personally look at the quality of the idea as one aspect to consider. A very rigorous paper that doesn't have really interesting ideas that the empirical assessment illustrates or takes forward, I think is of limited use. And a paper that puts forward a unique and interesting idea, but might not have actually resolved it because the data isn't available, but is able to take that idea forward enough that other people might be able to think about it and act on it, I think is something I would consider as a potentially good enough contribution to contribute to discussions in the way that I was kind of describing before. I think what happens sometimes is, this is my kind of hobby horse, I think we have a lot of feminist frameworks that we don't have similarly well-developed methods to operationalize those frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
I think theories jumped ahead of methods, basically. So often we get papers where people engage with theoretical frameworks and then they do analyses that are pretty much standard analyses that actually don't operationalize those frameworks well.
Mm-hmm.
And I would rather see a paper that grapples directly with that mismatch than one that provides an empirical analysis that has nothing to do with the feminist frameworks it engaged with at the beginning. So
Mm-hmm.
I would be asking those questions about the paper to decide how to move it in a direction that it was maybe making the kind of contribution that would take knowledge forward. But if it was a paper that sort of name-checked a lot of feminist frameworks, showed awareness of them, but then did an analysis that really didn't engaged with those frameworks in a way that's methodologically aligned with them, I would be less enthusiastic about that paper, and I'd be trying to communicate that to the authors. I think part of training in mainstream economics is very methods-led. And people almost learn that there are certain things in the toolbox that are the right way to do things. You know, probably showing my age, but back when I was a student, you know, Heckman's selection was the thing you did with everything. And it's like, well, that answers one kind of question and solves one kind of problem. We don't just start with those methods and sort of try and find a question that those methods answer. Feminist frameworks raise new questions, and we need to actually start taking forward those conversations about how we answer them well. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I really also appreciated the point that you made in your presentation in terms of the contribution and underscoring the contribution, and whether the sort of concluding contribution, right, of the paper really follows directly from the analysis carried out. Because that's another thing that we sometimes get in terms of submissions, where you have a kind of an introductory part that name checks a few feminist economists, and then this very technical kind of long center, and then a conclusion that doesn't really is not really warranted by the analysis.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think as well, I might be drawing too much on my own personal training experiences as a PhD student in economics. But I learned to think very much like a positivist, and to think about experimental methods as being what we're trying to approach empirically. And if you've been trained that way and you read the editorial policies of feminist economics, you might not really grasp what they're saying if this kind of positivist experimentalist framework has been so deeply ingrained in your thinking. So the idea that context matters is actually enormously profound in terms of challenging the way I was trained as an economist, because the experimental method seems to suggest that if you find a causal effect, it can be extrapolated relatively easily. Kind of like if you find out that the COVID vaccine works, right? But the social world is a lot more complex, and you know, causal effects are very local. And I think sometimes it's written clearly in the editorial policies, but I think there's a lot of unlearning that people sometimes have to do to really understand what the journal is asking them to do, or what the feedback is asking them to do. And again, that is where having this constructive mentoring tone, and where you're really empathically trying to understand what the author is trying to do, and your role as a reviewer is thinking about how to help them to achieve it, it can help with those conversations and that unlearning much more positively than just sort of saying, you haven't met the editorial policies. Because I think it's just hard to figure out what that means, and what the implications of, you know, things like, you know, you don't overgeneralize the findings to a different context is actually a profound feminist contribution, but it directly challenges so much of the quantitative microeconometrics that I learned as a PhD student.
That's great. So, and relatedly, can you talk a little bit about the sort of increase in, you know, gender economics research versus feminist economics research? And when you get a paper that you would call, you know, kind of a gender difference paper, how do you handle that as a reviewer?
I guess I tend to have an idea of what feminist research means. And I think sometimes feminist research can be about what Marjorie DeVault in sociology called the work of excavation. actually providing empirical evidence of gender differences can be useful, because frequently the default rational actor was a man.
Mhm.
And just drawing attention to how gender differences exist, what they look like in particular contexts, can be useful empirical exercises. I get a little bit concerned about the kind of gender economics which uses neoclassical frameworks to almost justify gender differences as somehow rational or
Mhm.
a competitive, efficient outcome, because that is actually not engaging with decades of feminist critique of that approach in economics. And I don't see it as very feminist, because I don't see it as very attentive to issues of power, either in society or in research processes. And it tends to just replicate harmful ideas rather than actually explore power and control in the research process. And I would try and draw the author's attention to thinking about maybe the implications of presenting research on gender in the way that they are.
Mhm.
I don't think if you do gender economics, you have much of a problem publishing it in some mainstream journals, because I think economists kind of like the functionalist explanations of gender. And I see feminist economics as actually challenging gender economics in terms of any kind of normative interpretation. But I'm still open to the idea that sometimes, the way we've studied migration has often had a default male who's completely unconnected with the family, moving based entirely on wages. And certainly looking at differences, gender differences in migration intentions and why people migrate might fall within gender economics. But if it sort of sticks to that kind of empirical excavation work, I'm okay. If it sort of says it's, the reason men migrate is this, and, we shouldn't be concerned about women migrants, or we should, when they move into sort of justifying gender differences or justifying inequalities as somehow an efficient outcome, that's when I get worried. And I think that's what people like Gary Becker did.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think I rambled there a little bit. Hopefully that was clear.
Should I ask another question, or do we have yes, great. So how does the responsibility that a reviewer takes on for knowledge production? You did touch on this a little bit in your talk, but being a reviewer for feminist economics really has an impact on the field of feminist economics. So how does that responsibility influence your approach to reviewing?
Well, I find it enormously humbling, to be honest. And I have to admit, this is also something I learned over time, because nobody told me. I never really understood how powerful research is. My sister and I were the first people that went to university, and I had to learn what academic research was really on my own. And I kind of saw it as just the same thing as producing assignments as an undergraduate. And when you produce assignments, your professor reads them, and your professor has to read them. And this idea that you're actually having to write things that you have to convince people they want to read, that they're an intended audience, was something that took me a long time as an author to understand. But then the flip side is the responsibility of being that intended audience, and actually trying to think about what different research approaches are perpetuating in terms of their taken for granted assumptions, or the potential political outcomes of depicting research in a certain, or carrying out research in a particular way. I did a lot of family economics early in my career, and I was trained in an economics department, and I had several papers where I was looking at people's decision to have a first birth or to have a subsequent birth in a low fertility setting like Europe. a lot of that work actually gets framed as being policy relevant because policymakers might be really interested in getting women to have more children. And that kind of approach to research actually doesn't fit my understanding of what feminist research is, because I think it's not really addressing power in research or controlling or harmful research practices. So as a reviewer, having the kind of commitment to a feminist methodology and feminist praxis is good about helping the discipline take forward conversations, but I think it also carries a particularly profound political responsibility that I wish I had come to appreciate a lot earlier in my career.
I know what you mean. So
Maybe,
any question? Yeah, please.
maybe we can have one more question from you if you have any, and then we open up the questions for the audience.
So you've talked about balancing being thorough and critical with maintaining principles of feminism, like inclusivity and equity, and respect in reviews. And I'll note sometimes to people that, I read all the reviews too before I send the decision to the author. And there have been times for sure where I've changed some language that is, overly judgmental or, just not mentoring.
Mm.
Do you find that challenging to balance the being thorough and critical with maintaining principles of feminism?
I think it is hard because it is not something many academics think about outside of feminist scholarship. I think the review process is often very harsh and aggressive, and people who haven't had particular instruction in how to write peer reviews just do what they've seen and what they themselves have experienced. Which is
Yeah.
part of the reason why things like this are so useful. I know, I can't remember if it was with you or with one of the earlier managing editors, but I've actually suppressed reports because I couldn't even rewrite them in a way to make them constructive. They were just so dismissive and harsh. And that's why I said maybe read it out loud, because I don't think people would talk to people like that. And sometimes the cloak of anonymity makes people not attentive enough to perhaps how they sound. And also, it's important to think about how the way things are worded would land on you. I'm going to make a confession. I, even to this day, get a set of reviews. I read them the first time and I get upset. Regardless of how nice they are, regardless of how clear they are, regardless of how constructive they are, they have commented on my baby and I'm really upset. And I put it in a drawer for a week and I take it out a week later and I read entirely different reviews. And often as I start working through the reviews, I get really engaged with what people are asking me to do, particularly if they are the kind of reviews we've been talking about, encouraging people to write. I published a paper in Feminist Economics, I think back in 2005, and I remember actually asking the editor, once a decision was made, to send a thank you note to the reviewers, because I actually had so much fun revising the paper because the comments were just so good and thought-provoking. And that is always what I try and think about. Are people going to respond to my comments as I responded to those comments? And I have to recognize that you have to say things really carefully, clearly, and kindly if people are going to be able to engage with them when they pull them out of the drawer after a week, if they're like me.
Well, yeah, it was really good. Thank you so much, both. That was a very fruitful discussion. So I think we can allocate 5 or 10 minutes for the questions from the audience. I'll moderate the questions in the chat, and then feel free to raise your hands and ask your question too. So there's one question on the chat that I want to ask from Olivia. So she said, I've been sent review request, but as a young scholar, I do not feel I have enough experience or expertise in that field to review, so I decline. So when would you say someone is ready to review or experienced or expert enough to review?
I think if you wait to be the perfect expert, you're never going to be. And being straightforward with the person who asked you to review about what you think your expertise is and what maybe your gaps in knowledge are can open up a conversation about why you were asked to review in the first place. Another thing that you can do, with my PhD students and my postdocs, I offer to look at reviews before they send them. If they take something on and they're feeling a little bit like they're lacking in confidence or they're not sure that they've necessarily put into practice all the advice that I've given them about how to write a review. Asking mentors for help and advice is really useful. You know, recognizing we're all interdependent and we all need help, which is also a feminist principle, I think is really important, and not trying to just kind of figure it out on your own. Means that maybe you have some fantastic ideas that get out there sooner because you get the support in sharing them and engaging with research. And I would say declining reviews can be detrimental to early career scholars because you're not getting exposed to models of what research looks like, to the kind of reports that get written. So if you review a paper and then somebody revises and resubmits, you can see the other reports that were written. And you can develop much more of an appreciation for the field and some of those conversations that are happening at that cocktail party if you agree to engage as a reviewer. And if you just sit it out until you feel 100% confident to go join that conversation, it might have moved on by the time you get there. Did you want to add anything, Elissa?
Yeah, I really appreciate your response, but you know, just to emphasize some of the elements that you brought up, including you don't have to be an expert in every aspect of the paper. There's a collection of reviewers, and often, you know, you end up combining reviewers that have different sorts of expertise across different methodologies or literatures. So I wouldn't let that stop you, but I would just be clear maybe in the review that, you know, you don't have a expertise in this particular estimator or this particular region of the world, or, you know, but I think we can all provide useful reviews.
And
So
if you have that upfront discussion, it's not going to feed into the reviewer score that we were talking about, so that you never get asked again because you know you only commented on the stuff that you knew about. Because if you have those conversations, or you make it clear make it clear in the report what your expertise is and what you're focusing on, it's not seen as an overly narrow set of comments. It's a justified narrowness based on your expertise, and quite probably one that the editor knew about when you were invited, because that expertise is why you were invited.
Okay. So Danya has a question, and I see that he's so raised hand. So you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions. I suppose I wanted to ask about a couple of things. I think, firstly, I have an issue with the fact that we would expect that feminist economics would be one of the first fields to lead the way when it comes to reforming practices within the academy regarding the exclusion of diverse voices due to the ongoing effects of colonization. However, we have unfortunately yet to see the results that we would like to. And one area that is personal to me that I guess diverges into the second part of the question that relates to, is the way in which we define and understand the definition of migrant women, or women of colour when we look into developed and developing countries, because I think that the definition is rather confining. I think, of course, it's important that we focus upon current and recent migrants, but as the child of, very poor migrants from India, where I was subjected to an attempted, coerced marriage and things like that, and have faced immense difficulty in spite of, hard-fought education in economic terms, it's disappointing that we don't really see calculations in enough mainstream studies when it comes to how migrant status and race have ongoing effects for people in my position, as of course, I'm far from the only one, and many would experience worse. And so I suppose I just wanted to ask the panel what they think of that, as well as what they think that feminist economists should be doing specifically, and I guess how the panelists are acting in their own practice to make sure that they break down barriers when it comes to, colonialism and racism in the academy. I'm sorry, that's a long question.
I'm afraid about not necessarily doing justice to it, because the session is on peer review, and peer review is only one aspect of the way you can deal with this.
Of course.
So I'll address it within the parameters of this session, but I think that it's a broader problem. But let me at least maybe try and say, from the context of this idea about good practice in peer review and changing the academy and leading change in the academy in terms of peer review, one of the things you can do is agree to review papers and raise these issues with authors. You can write papers that make these arguments and submit it to Feminist Economics in a way that engages with the conversations that you find incomplete or not necessarily helpful, and hopefully have reviewers that will then engage with your arguments constructively and in a way that takes things forward. If we change the review process to make it more collaborative, constructive, and that recognizes that we're trying to create spaces where we can envision feminist futures, we're creating a space where those ideas are going to be more easily articulated and not just dismissed because they don't fit what Kuhn would call the normal science of economics. So being a peer reviewer who really commits to feminist principles and being an author who's willing to throw those ideas out there with the hope that feminist reviewers will engage productively with those is really about the only way we can start to change things. If people don't submit papers that present these ideas or contribute to these discussions, we're limited to some extent in what we can do unless we do a special issue and really sort of twist people's arms to write papers for us. So some of it is actually being willing to step up and initiate or curate those conversations as an independent researcher. And then as a peer reviewer, being generous and understanding that sometimes communicating, articulating, and justifying new ideas is more difficult. And that might mean spending a lot more time reviewing the article, maybe reading it 3 times to make sure that you're really following what somebody's trying to do.
Interruption, but you've helped me, I suppose, crystallize through your response perhaps more a focused way of trying to word one of the concerns that I have that's specific to the review process. That being that I feel a number of journals lack sufficient protocols regarding, the need to ensure that there is, a cross-section and sufficient diversity amongst reviewers, and also that there's a protocol and education around how to understand what people are giving when they provide those reviews as often we see intersectional input completely discarded or dismissed. And I think to your point around people needing to write papers, as somebody who's hoping to, grow into a career more surrounding research and who's very interested in these issues, I think a substantial barrier is getting, mentorship and individuals to co-author papers with you. And so I suppose I guess, wanted to see if it was possible to follow on from that and ask you how you think it might be wise to try to work to get past that.
Did you want to?
Sure. Thank you for your questions. I think we can always do a better job in the reviewing process, but at Feminist Economics, we do have a couple of editorial policies that try to address that a little bit. So one is our international policy on international perspectives, where if you'll notice, all of the articles that are published in Feminist Economics, if they're about a particular country or region, they have that in the title. And in terms of the discussion, editorially, we pay very close attention to not assuming that what that researcher is finding for this one context, again, context is important, just applies to everywhere else. So trying to be aware and intentional around that. We also have a policy in terms of reviewers, and maybe this is something that we should revisit, that at least one of the reviewers has to come from outside North America. Now, I've never heard of any other journal that has a policy like that, and we could revisit and reconsider. But that is something that we're doing along those lines and trying to ensure some kind of diverse perspectives in the reviews that we get.
Can I just add one other thing quickly? I remember reading a paper in sociology about 10 years ago, and they were talking about how feminist sociologists had developed a conceptual framework, the gender relations framework, Myra Ferry called it, or genderist structure, if you're Risman. But then they were like, all of this feminist work was developed, and yet in the American Sociological Review, people wrote research that completely didn't cite, disregarded, didn't use these frameworks. And one of the things that they concluded was that the gatekeepers were letting that research in. And that goes back to the slide I was showing you about letting bad research in or keeping good research out and striking that balance. Engaging as a peer reviewer with authors, but holding them to account for knowing the state of research and actually showing familiarity with it, not letting them get away with ignoring intersectionality and things that you think are important, is the corrective, and it's the flip side of what you were saying might happen in other journals. And ideally, if we do that in feminist economics, we will change the field, because the conversations will go forward and the other journals will be left behind. But it's a slow process, and it's also one that we need sort of collective responsibility to take forward.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for these questions and answers. So I'm deeply sorry that we're out of time, but I would like to give you each maybe 1 minute to share your last reflections, and maybe you can answer this question: how can review skills be improved while writing reviews? So and then after that we will conclude.
So maybe I'll speak up here, which is one thing. If you would like to review for Feminist Economics, you can sign up on the website, feministeconomics.org. And when you do that, you get put into a database that our about 35 associate editors can access. So when they're looking for specific areas of regional or thematic expertise, you can do that. I would highly recommend in terms of improving your review, I think that following the guidelines that Wendy talked about today is a great first step. And, make yourself available to review. I think practice is a good thing. I'm sorry, and I just want to say thank you so much for having us today. I'll have to get off really quickly after Wendy's going. I have another meeting, but
I will try and be quick, especially because we've gone over. I could talk about this forever. But I just wanted to say the fact that you've shown up today shows an interest, and it gives me a lot of faith in the future. Part of being a feminist, as I understand it, is about mentoring and solidarity. Don't be afraid to ask your mentors for advice. IAFFE has a mentoring program. Some people have better access to mentors than others, but ask your friends how they use their mentors. That's something else I had to learn. I never knew how to use a mentor. That took me a while. Having these explicit conversations about how to do things, what you wish you knew earlier, can sometimes be really helpful. And it is useful even with just your peers to share peer reviews so that people can learn from each other and each other's experiences and have conversations about it, just like you read one another's papers. It's like everything else, it's a learning process. You're going to feel that your skills develop over time, but you want to be willing to step up and be part of the conversation. That's the difference between being a student and being a scholar in your own right. And ask for help, but at the same time, don't be afraid to put yourself forward.
Thank you. Thank you for these last reflections and for all those valuable things you shared with us today. And there are many tips and insights we can take away from these discussions. And thank you to the editors and to all who joined the session. And please look out for our upcoming online events. And thank you so much.